Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome everyone to this session of Is Pleasure Still a Key Concept for Psychoanalysis? Theoretical Clinical Perspectives of Our Practice. My name is Elizabeth Danzy, and I'm a candidate at the Dallas Psychoanalytic Center and a member of the IPA Communications Committee. Before I introduce the speakers today and we begin our discussion, just say a few words about what we're thinking about our colleagues in Russia and in Ukraine and really all over the world. Just want to acknowledge that today. The presentation, I'll say a few words about the presentation. As you see, the speakers are Dr. Nelson Ernesto Coelho, Joseph Neworth, and Rachel Chaplin. Before I introduce the first speaker, I'll say a few words about the webinar today and the format. The first part of the discussion and panel presentations will be about a 10 to 15 minute presentation by each panelist, and then an opportunity for the panelists to comment on each other's papers and thoughts about this topic, and also to answer questions from all of you, the attendees. You'll find a questions box on the right side of the screen. If you would like to ask a question, please write this in the box. You can post your questions throughout the whole course of the webinar from the very beginning, but please know that the questions will not be answered until after all three presentations from the panelists have been completed. So let's begin. We'll start with the first presenter today. Nelson Ernesto Coelho, Jr. is a professor and researcher at the Institute of Psychology of the University of São Paulo, Brazil. A psychoanalyst, he is currently directing research into the history and philosophy of psychology and psychoanalysis. He is also a consultant for research foundations and scientific journals. Among his recent publications are articles in Culture and Psychology, Revista Brasileira de Psychanalyse and Terapia Psicológica from Chile. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Coelho.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everybody. It's really a tough work for us today, talking about pleasure, thinking about pleasure in such a difficult situation. But I'll try to do my best. Is pleasure still a key concept for psychoanalysis? My answer is yes. Pleasure is still a key concept for psychoanalysis, but not for the same reason that made Freud postulate the metapsychological concept of the pleasure principle. I have no doubt that in contemporary psychoanalysis, we must reactivate the importance of pleasure as a concept, as well as an element of body psychic experience in an analytic process. I quote a recent work of Rachel Peltz when she writes, "The emphasis here is on activating effective, vitalizing presences in the field of the analytic relationship." Even more, pleasure is needed as one of the analytic field dimensions, especially in treatments with patients who have what Thomas Ogden calls unlived lives, when we must co-create a very specific emotional contact. Vitalization is about binding, what Freud called in German Bindung, and about eros, the life drive, usually bringing increase and not discharge of tension, in contrast with Freud's conception of the pleasure principle. To put things more clearly, vitalization is not only about increasing or injecting tension and offering a different kind of pleasure, but it's mainly about feeling alive with pleasure, but also with pain and suffering. So the opposition here is not pleasure versus deadness, but feeling alive versus living an unlived life. Freud's 1920 turn and the theory of trauma and pain derived from his second drive dualism insert us in a new realm of pleasure and pain, very different from the pleasure principle. The traumatic becomes, in the second Freudian topic, to be associated with the dynamics of the death drive and automatic anxiety, the one that continually makes a demand for psychic work, more specifically, binding, as the first containment measure prior to the establishment of the pleasure principle. When there is no possibility of binding and transcribing the event, its effects are presented in a negative way as narcissistic damage. From 1920 onwards, in his Beyond the Pleasure principle, Freud approached trauma to the functioning of the instinctual chaos present in the id, which incessantly carries out a work pressure on the psychic apparatus. Let us remember that from 1923 onwards, Freud located the psychic domain of the primary moment in which prevails the need of binding, like that of an id in the process of differentiation, when we cannot distinguish what would be the id and what would be the body. The work that trauma demands is thus a job of capturing the drive, a binding job, hence the possibility of thinking that there is a traumatic potentiality, a zone of non-representation at the root of the drive. The traumatic, in this way, approaches the functioning of the death drive in the psyche. Therefore, I believe it is still necessary to insist on the Freudian concepts reinstating corporeality within Freudian theory and clinical practice, as well as to reinstate the relation between corporeality and the ego. It is a question of initially highlighting what Freud demonstrated as the birth of the ego, which means a distinction from the id, a proto-separation from the drives and from the thematic dimension itself. However, this initial moment is, according to various psychoanalytical propositions, also the moment at which the body, or corporeality, is separated from the mother, a separation that occurs by means of primary identificatory processes. This is when the so-called marks on the body appears, which means constitutive elements that are not images or representations, but operations that leave marks and scars in the identified body, perhaps forming the basis of what have been designated body memories. The two separations from the id and from the body of the mother that allow the ego to emerge are not, however, definitive exclusions of these two figures of corporeality. One can hardly imagine the ego, in its project of gaining autonomy, being able to dispense with the drives and the identificatory marks that made it what it is. Here lies what interests me the most. If on the one hand, we need to acknowledge the role of external perception in the development of the ego, in its distinction from the id, there is, on the other hand, no denying the constant presence of the id as an element of the ego. The origin of the ego, both in its development and in its presence as a previously formed component of the psychic apparatus, reveals its double face, the opening to the world, to the others, by means of external perception, and at the same time, the interweaving of the ego with the id, our cauldron of drives. So, in a paper that I wrote in 2010, I suggested that we consider the basis of the analytical field as body-psychic continuity, a co-corporeality, a material and energetic fabric that is also mobile and unstable, moved by messenger drives and marked by internal and external intensity interference constituting a field of forces, pleasure, distress, and proto-meanings. Co-corporeality that is not an indistinct unit, but the presence of two corporealities, each being more than a unit closed within itself. Co-corporeality in which two and one are always simultaneous. Corporeality of patient and analyst. Co-corporeality is the realm of origin of a relationship in which the processes of transference and countertransference are lived and felt. The corporeality of the analyst in response to the corporeality of the patient, a response that might include experiences of sleepiness, boredom, sexual desire, sadness, anger, aggressive sadistic impulses, pleasure, distress, etc. Obviously, we've come a long way from Freud's economic quantitative conception of pleasure and pleasure as the main source of motivation of the mental apparatus, and the importance of the pleasure principle as a metapsychological concept, to Ferenczi, who tried to describe the gradations between the principles of pleasure and reality. The originality of Ferenczi's thought in comparison to Freud lies in the emphasis given to the intersubjective aspect of the constitution of subjectivity and of the trauma. Ferenczi identifies the effects of the interaction between adults and their children. It is possible to notice a theoretical change in psychoanalysis, as the author abandoned the emphasis on the psychological effects of the relationship to understand the overall experience of the encounter. In another moment of our history, André Green, the French psychoanalyst, reminds us sexuality and pleasure lost some importance in psychoanalysis, first by Fairbairn's replacing the pleasure-seeking orientation of psychic activity with an object-seeking one involved a desexualization of the theory. In the words of the author Ruth Stein in a 1999 book, we will find Green's own ideas on pleasure. I quote, "The policy of sharply distinguishing between the unconscious as the seat of pleasure and the id as the seat of the drives that represent a demand for psychic work helps Green with the problem of the double edge of effects. It accommodates, on the one hand, the unruly, pleasure-seeking character of affects, and, on the other hand, the fact of their obedience to structures and rules. This dual nature of affects makes them amenable to being experienced in contradictory ways. Another problem about which Green is concerned, however, remains unsolved, and that is the problem of the representation of affect." End of quotation. But let us briefly return to Fairbairn. He indicates, I quote, "If it be true that libido is object-seeking and not pleasure-seeking, there is, of course, no pleasure principle to go beyond. This fact does not, of course, prevent such activities constituting a source of pleasure, since pleasure has no special connection with libido, but it is a natural accompaniment of relief of tension, irrespective of the nature of the forces whose tension is relieved." End of quotation of Fairbairn. Now, Winnicott's contribution to the subject must also be mentioned in our short history. The importance he attached to playing is central to our present state of the art of pleasure in psychoanalysis. Winnicott offers us a group of concepts that seek to describe different maturational stages of human emotional development and their disturbances. The relationship forms between an infant and its mother, and between the analyst and the analysant, between the infant and its first object. Bearing in mind the positive dimensions of illusion and the need to acknowledge the role of creativity and play in the subjective and intersubjective constitutive processes, Winnicott opts to value and conceptually construct an in-between space, which is a space of illusion. This space, which is originally the space for infantile play, where it is a pleasure to hide and to be found, is also the place of creativity and the future place of culture experience. The joy expressed by a child, both at hiding and being found, is related to the pleasure they feel at discovering a person who wants them and wants to find them. And even before, it is about the pleasure to be alive, and then the pleasure of the experience of feeling alive. I quote Winnicott, "Psychotherapy takes place in the overlap of two areas of playing, that of the patient and that of the therapist. Psychotherapy has to do with two people playing together. The corollary of this is that where playing is not possible, then the work done by the therapist is directed toward bringing the patient from a state of not being able to play into a state of being able to play." End of quotation. And also, as indicated by Antonino Ferro, the pleasure of analytic work, and especially of work in the session, has not until now been taken much into consideration. He thinks an aspect of pleasure is the co-narration to which patient and analyst contribute in sessions. Returning to where we started with vitalization and pleasure, we find the fundamental contribution of Anne Alvarez to our team. I quote, she says, "I do believe that pleasure may be just as thought-provoking as distress, because pleasure comes in as great a variety of forms as does distress." End of quotation. And still another quotation now from Diana Lees, North American psychoanalyst. And that's why, I quote, "being creatively alive is not solely excitement, pleasure, but the soil in which psychic pain can be metabolized." End of quotation. So, I finished here. Pleasure and vitalization. In some ways, in many of our clinical works, what we see ourselves impelled to do is to inject pleasure and vitality, to bring vitalization and pleasure to unlived lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nelson, for that wonderful presentation. There's a lot to think about there. Let's move on to our next speaker. Joseph Neworth is a professor emeritus of the Derner School of Psychology at the Adelphi University. He is a supervisor at the NYU postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, New York University, and is on the faculty and a supervisor at the National Training Program at the National Institute of Psychotherapies, New York, New York. He received his BA from the City College of New York, his PhD from the University of Massachusetts, and his psychoanalytic training at the William Alanson White Institute. He has published numerous articles in professional journals and frequently presents papers at national and international conferences. His first book, Between Emotion and Cognition, The Generative Unconscious, 2003, received the Gradiva Prize for Critical Analysis and Interpretation in 2004. His second book, From Sign to Symbol, Transformational Process in Psychoanalysis, Psychotherapy, and Psychology, in 2018, was published by Lexington Books and received the American Board and the Academy of Psychoanalysis Annual Book Award 2019 in Clinical Psychoanalysis. I'll turn it over to you, Joe.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I want to thank the IPA for inviting me to participate in this webinar and wish everyone a good day. In thinking about the title of this webinar and the question it poses, the answer is clearly yes. Pleasure is still a key concept in psychoanalysis. I want to focus on jokes and humor as a source of pleasure in clinical work and highlight the structural aspects of humor from Freud's early ideas to contemporary theory. As psychoanalysis evolved from a theory of conflict to differentiating past from present and now towards the transformation of impersonal symptomatic experiences into dreamlike metaphorical structures. Pleasure has become an even more critical element in the psychoanalytic process. In Freud's early writing, pleasure was viewed as one side of the central conflict that human beings confronted and which we needed to protect ourselves from by subordinating the pleasure principle to the reality principle, and later installing the superego over the ego and id. Freud saw sexuality and pleasure as a riptide that would pull us away from civilization towards the world of the primal horde of incest and murder. The pursuit of pleasure would lead to the loss of our capacity for rational choice and the destruction of civilization. I strongly believe that the First World War changed many of Freud's views, including his ideas about pleasure. Although Freud did not critique his earlier views on the dangers of pleasure and beyond the pleasure principle, which was 1920, he addressed the idea that people are often not motivated by the pursuit of pleasure or by mature rational thought, but repeat painful experiences in which they seem to pursue unhappiness and misery. Freud began beyond the pleasure principle, discussing the limitations placed on the pleasure principle, reiterating the ideas that the presence of external danger necessitated its subordination to the reality principle. The second limitation, which challenged Freud's understanding of the importance of the pleasure principle, was his observation of traumatic and war neuroses. The symptoms of these neuroses did not fit his theory. Patients who experienced trauma were frequently awakened in states of terror by dreams in which they relived their traumatic experiences over and over again. Freud developed the concept of the repetition compulsion in order to address the painful symptoms of the traumatic and war neuroses. He expanded and normalized the importance of repetition, presenting a charming discussion of his grandson's Fort Da game, which he thought of as a way that his grandchild mastered the painful feelings caused by his mother's leaving him. Freud presented the Fort Da game as a model in which an overwhelming, distressing event, which is experienced passively, is mastered through repetition and turning it into an active, pleasurable experience, a game. Freud's discussion of his grandchild's Fort Da game anticipates Winnicott's views of therapy as a subset of play, of transitional experience and symbol formation, as well as Fonagy's discussion of the importance of the pretend mode in developing the capacity for mature human relationships, emotional connection, and understanding. Both transitional experience and the pretend mode bring into the forefront the importance of pleasure, as well as the necessity of primary process, symmetrical, dream-like experiences for a developing mind. In 1905, Freud described jokes, humor, and wit as unconscious productions, universal experiences, like dreams, in which processes of condensation and displacement organize and generate deep emotional meaning. He suggested the concept of joke work as parallel to dream work, to explain the process through which perceptions, drives, and affects are pulled into the unconscious, resulting in the creation of jokes, moments of disinhibition of pleasure and of controlled as well as uncontrolled laughter. Freud's concept of joke work, like his concept of dream work, are shorthand attempts to explain the complex affective and cognitive processes involved in the unconscious creation of meaning, which have been described by Mate Blanco as the layering of symmetrical and asymmetrical thought, and by Kleinians as processes of symbolization within the depressive position, and by Lacan as metaphoric processes of substitution. In 1927, in a brief follow-up paper on humor, Freud moved away from a model of the mind which was centered on the inhibition and discharge of drives, and suggested a new understanding of jokes and humor in an early object relations theory in which the superego functioned like a kind parent, reassuring a frightened child, as if the inner parent were saying, "Look, here is the world which seems so dangerous. It is nothing but a game for children, just worth making a jest about." Freud began this 1927 paper with a joke that described an individual's triumph over adversity. Interestingly, Freud presented the same joke in his earlier work, which suggests to me a personal importance and a special pleasure that he does not discuss. Here is Freud's joke. A criminal who was being led out to the gallows on Monday remarked, "Well, this week is beginning nicely." I believe that Freud's repeating this joke reflected an important aspect of his identification with the criminal as both an outsider and as one who challenges authorities and ultimately has the last laugh. Freud seemed to conceptualize humor as a potential asset, a synthetic process, and a means for individuals to triumph over the inevitable limitations of life, suffering, and external reality. Like a Buddhist koan, this joke describes an important paradox. It reflects both the shortness of life and the eternity of a moment. It emphasizes the necessity to take pleasure in one's circumstances, to transcend the experiences of limitation, persecution, powerlessness, meaninglessness, and insignificance. In a Buddhist koan, which I think of as similar to Freud's joke, a young monk is being chased by a hungry tiger. He reaches a cliff and is about to jump to safety when he sees below him several tigers. Hanging over the cliff, barely within reach, is a fragile branch with one perfect strawberry dangling off the end. What is he to do? How is he to escape this dilemma, his fate? The monk's solution is to jump and grab the fragile branch and enjoy the perfect strawberry as he falls through space to his encounter with the hungry tigers, with his fate with the Lacanian real. Although Freud did not suggest the use of humor in clinical work, his ironic sensibility and his use of dreamlike metaphors undoubtedly was an important part of his clinical effort. Like this joke, his comment on entering New York Harbor on his trip to Clark University expresses his wise perception of the double meaning of psychoanalysis. He said, perhaps as he gazed at the Statue of Liberty, "I am bringing the plague to America." A similar use of irony occurred when Freud was ransomed from being held prisoner by the Nazis. The SS insisted that he write a letter exonerating them of any harmful experiences or intentions, which Freud ended with a postscript in which he recommended the SS's hospitality. I position my use of humor and jokes as part of a larger view of analysis as a transformational process, which has been influenced by contemporary Kleinians, including Bion, Grotstein, Ogden, Farrow, and Mate Blanco. These theorists focus on the creation of meaning through the development of metaphors and metaphoric enactments, dream-like thoughts, often developing after long periods of empty conversations in which the analyst is evacuating deadened and deadening experiences. My process of joke work involves reverie, experiencing aspects of the analytic conversation from an ironic or humorous perspective, and being able to present myself as the embodiment of a disowned aspect of the patient. For example, with a patient who compulsively presented her stepdaughter as if she were a criminal, I was able to embody a prosecutor-persecutor from the McCarthy era and say that in my pocket, I had a list of those people in the Communist Party. With another patient who always looked to others for direction and help and idealized me as the all-knowing analyst, I enacted a hyper-confident therapist who knew exactly how the patient should act. However, I created a dilemma for this patient by ironically stating that before he takes my advice, he should know that some therapists work for God and some therapists work for the devil, and who, with a dramatic pause, did he think I worked for? Lastly, with a patient who was argumentative and judgmental and felt that I did not engage him in the way he would like, I ironically asserted that I was a real snowflake. All of these ironic comments shifted our discourse from its focus on repetitive empty words to an intersubjective now moment, which introduced pleasure and humor into our dialogue and allowed the patient to begin to integrate the disowned aspect of their unconscious experience, which had been previously unsymbolized and evacuated. These dreams, like humorous enactments, grew out of my process of reverie, and as Freud commented about jokes, had a spontaneous, involuntary, and unbidden nature, which reflected their origin, like dreams, in the unconscious mind. We have an indefinable feeling, rather, which I can best compare to an absence, sudden release of intellectual tension, and then all at once the joke is there, as a rule ready clothed in words. We can never know why a particular joke emerges with a particular patient at any one time. With the use of jokes and humor, the analyst chooses a symmetrical strategy, introducing a dimension of pleasure while revealing aspects of his or her own inner world. I clearly enjoy the opportunity to become a paranoid, grandiose prosecutor-persecutor who knew everybody's secrets when I spontaneously made my reference to the McCarthy hearings. I could also address my patients viewing me as a godlike presence, and lastly could accept feeling in an inferior position to my argumentative patient. A joke introduces a potential experiences of intense affect and pleasure into the analytic relationship, which tests the parochial and scientific limits that we have imposed on our professional behavior. However, the capacity to use jokes and humor in approaching the limitations, tragedies, and finality of life has been a part of psychoanalytic and human wisdom throughout the ages. I believe that the experience of analytic transformation can only be achieved through acknowledging the pleasure and acceptance of those unacceptable and disowned parts of ourselves that we find at the core of jokes and humor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe, for that fantastic paper presentation. We'll move on to Rachel. Dr. Chaplin. Dr. Chaplin is a training and supervising analyst of the British Psychoanalytic Society. She's an honorary associate professor at University College London, where she teaches and convenes seminars on French psychoanalysis and literature and psychoanalysis for the MSc in theoretical psychoanalysis. She has published on psychic bisexuality and on the necessity for representational pleasure in response to trauma. Thank you, Rachel. I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. So my paper's called In Defense of the Bonus of Pleasure, the Engine of the Talking Cure. It feels rather frivolous, shameful even, to speak up for pleasure, and I think particularly this week. But I'm honoured to be one of today's 3 defenders of pleasure, exploring what place we can find for it, both in our metapsychology and in our practice as psychoanalysts. My focus is on representing pleasure, pleasure in representing, a pleasure which is at the heart of the development of the functioning psyche. I will suggest that when representing pleasure is impaired, the analytic task is to revivify this pleasure, if possible, so that trauma can be both delimited through naming and diffused or dispersed along the signifying chain. Pleasure is a constant of Freud's metapsychology, but its place in his theory is mobile, as Nelson and Joe have been describing. Pleasure is dangerous, luring us away from reality testing, only for Freud to flip his thinking and to say this is a detour to a greater pleasure. And in 1920, in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, whilst the repetition compulsion, which he finds to be active in traumatic dreams, as Joe described, whilst the repetition compulsion overrides the pleasure principle, it also works retroactively to bind trauma in order to introduce and ensure the dominance of the pleasure principle. So the first part of my paper is called A Contemporary Metapsychology of Pleasure. And I'll begin with a quotation from the French psychoanalyst Pierre Aulagnier. Any act of representation entails an experience of pleasure. With this remark, any act of representation entails an experience of pleasure, Aulagnier situates pleasure at the heart of the drive to represent. The compulsion to represent has been explored by Roland, Eisenstein, Levine, and Green, amongst others. Green writes that, beyond the representation of what is painted, and he's thinking of the nude and its origins in the child's experience, the object of the artist is painting, not the object, not the picture, but the process, painting. Painting or representing, the capacity to find thing presentations, hallucinations, unconscious fantasies, dream images, and finally words with which to process psychic experience. Aulagnier offers us an elaborated account of how pleasure is activated in the psychic system through reciprocal bodily and affective experience in the infant's first encounter with the world as embodied by the mother. She writes that, in the moment when the mouth meets the breast it meets and swallows a first mouthful of the world, a primal prototypical representation is formed with which to metabolize the encounter. This she calls the pictogram, which records this encounter between a sensory zone, the mouth, and the object that satisfies it, the breast. The pictogram also encodes the affective experience at that moment as a pleasure or unpleasure, which colours the infant's subsequent attitude to representation. And the object must be representable as enjoying pleasure too, because at this level or this stage, there's no self-other differentiation. A first representation having been achieved, a hallucinatory wish fulfillment, there's a danger that the work-shy mind settles for this minimum pleasure, which relieves the psyche of the agitations of desire and offers nirvana, lovely non-desire. To offset this, the satisfaction of bodily needs must be accompanied by a bonus or a surplus of representational pleasure, which becomes the aim of psychical activity. Pleasure as the engine of the working psyche and the analytic process, of course, one association followed by another. The pleasure bonus drives the elaboration of further representational systems within the psyche, from pictogram to unconscious fantasy, and finally to sense-making in language. The pictogram is only knowable by its effects, like the unconscious. What we can hear is the baby being lured into the alienness of language by the pleasure incarnated in our cooings and pluckings. Through oral and actually oral pleasure, we teach babies to play, as Winnicott says, not just with presence and absence, hide and seek, but with the sounds that will become words to name the game, fort da, as Joe has been reminding us. And we can hear parental pleasure in the encounter with the infant's body when it's verbal. When I sat down to write this, I remembered 50 years ago my father's delight in calling my baby brother's fingers chipolatas. In effect, the feeling embodied in the mother's offer of a breast, a touch, or a word is an effectively coloured message to the infant, or interpretation. This message inflicts primary violence on the infant mind, as it anticipates meaning that the infant cannot yet meet. It carries an excess of meaning, excitation, frustration, gratification. But this primary violence is necessary. The psyche must get to its representing work, and the puzzling excesses in this first message kickstart the process of psychic metabolizing, like slapping an infant's back to get it breathing. And this is our constant working dilemma. Interpret now. Is that too much meaning, too soon, or is it time to kickstart further elaboration? In summary, mental representations are created by the infant from its bodily experience of the earliest sensations of pleasure. Sometimes the first maternal interpretation erupts with unnecessary violence. And by way of a case study, I'm going to look at an autobiographical account by the poet Elizabeth Bishop, an account of her early childhood, which is called In the Village. The first sentence of this text reads, "A scream, full stop. Unplaceable, unowned, shocking." It's thought that Bishop's psychotic mother may have screamed at her child, "I want to kill you." After this message, the narrating child's bodily perceptions are profoundly disturbed. She asks, why is the sky turning too blue? Wonders, is there something wrong with her eyes? Is there something wrong with the sky? This damage is also audible in her language. Here is her account of her mother's toing and froing between the asylum and home. First, she had come home with her child. Then she had gone away again, alone, and left the child. Then she had come home. Then she had gone away again with her sister, and now she was home again. I think this is Eisenstein's dismal speech, thin and flat, factual, devoid of affect, playfulness, and metaphor. Language seems half dead, undercathected. We could compare these sentences to the traumatic dreams that Freud observed in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, repetitive attempts to bind trauma, blighted by shock. But the scream is followed by the noise of the village blacksmith hammering at his anvil. The child becomes intensely attached to this beautiful sound and calls for it repeatedly throughout the text. In it, she seems to hear a different message, one carrying the promise of a bonus of pleasure, countering the impact of the scream. It ushers in a remarkable shift in her linguistic register. She starts playing with the patterns of words. Things hang up in the shadows, and shadows hang up in the things. She generates affective similes, like bloody little moons. And very simply, she enjoys the sounds that words can make. Smack, 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 for the sound of her cow's cowpats. 3 smacks would normally do. 4 gives her a little excess of pleasure, onomatopoeic pleasure, to counter the excess of unpleasure transmitted by the scream. Recathecting language, she systematically names her world. She describes the village. And progressively, the objects she sees realign with ordinary perceptions. Finally, she looks down from a bridge into the waters of a stream, at the bottom of which discarded and broken objects rest peacefully. And I'll just quote the next bit. But still, once in a while, the river gives an unexpected gurgle. Slup, it says. Her mother's scream resurfaces once in a while as slup. It's now not quite nameable. Slup is hard to say, but it can be indexically indicated. Not mastery over trauma, but the capacity to point to its resurfacing. So pleasure in practice. What are we analysts to do with this story about, or perhaps theorization of, the impact of trauma on representation? We respond, often subliminally, I think, to the damaged functioning in our patient's speech. Important to note that we encounter not just affective deficits, but also affective excess in some borderline presentations when meaningful speech comes under enormous strain because it's so flooded with affect and excitement. Words are sexual organs, speaking is sex. Olagnier describes the mother's speech as erogenous, and I can hear my father's libidinal pleasure, double libidinal pleasure, in nicknaming his son's fingers. Pleasure in naming, pleasure in thinking of eating those little fingers. Sexuality is in play. Green identifies a double transference onto the analyst and onto the act of speaking. 2 strands of sexual activity in play simultaneously. Freud, in 1905, observes that through her caressing physical care for her child's body, the mother transmits feelings derived from her own sexual life. The language of passion is inevitably interwoven with the language of tenderness. Do we lure our patients away from reality, seduced by and seducing with the pleasure of analytic words? Freud reassures us, in her seduction, the mother is fulfilling her task, teaching the child to love. Are we then erogenous blacksmiths? The blacksmith is quite sexy and vigorous, it has to be said. Are we erogenous blacksmiths, energetically revivifying representation through different sounds, which counter the initial damage inflicted on our patients' cathexis of representation, teaching them to love to represent? Dangerous pleasure, necessary pleasure. This is the tightrope we walk. The talking cure is intrinsically a cure of the talking, gathering and channeling body, action, affect, fantasy, and dreams into words, riven through by a bonus of representing pleasure. Towards the end of her famous poem, One Art, having listed a terrible series of losses, Elizabeth Bishop faces one further loss, losing you, which she says looks like disaster. She hesitates, then instructs herself firmly. Write it like disaster. She seems to wait to feel the force of like, which renders loss metaphorically but not actually disastrous. Through a commitment to representation, write it, she finds metaphoricity and liberates herself from fixation to trauma. This is the genius of language. When the child starts playing with it, things hang up in the shadows and shadows hang up in the things. She finds that shadows and things can be shifted around, maybe reversed. Things can be any things. Infinite meanings can emerge. Speech can now do its transformational work of binding, as it nearly names, and so delimits trauma, and its unbinding work, unraveling trauma's knots in the tug of the signifying chain. Wordsworth writes that in describing any passions whatsoever, the mind will as a whole be in a state of enjoyment. I think this is true of the analytic process. However painful or awful the work, analyst and patient alike are supported in keeping going by the bonus of representing pleasure, not just by truthfulness. Wordsworth and Freud are long gone, but it's this sometimes baffling, probably often baffling, state of enjoyment which remains the engine of the talking cure. Pleasure as a key element in contemporary metapsychology and practice.
Thank you, Rachel, for that wonderful paper. I very much appreciate the juxtaposition of these three presentations. I thought they were each brought something different and unique to the conversation around pleasure. We have a question from someone in the audience, so I will I'll jump to that question, but if there is something that any of you would like to address, or if you have a question for one of the other speakers or panelists, please feel free to jump in at any time. But I will ask this question that seems particularly relevant today. Given our shared context of a developing war in Europe, it is both very difficult and important to be thinking about pleasure. We are faced with the tragedy of war and the terror of those on the ground in Ukraine and those in Russia who object to military action. The webinar approach to pleasure seems to capture the basis of resilience. Might the panelists comment on the bridge in their minds between pleasure and the experience of war? I'll let one of you begin. Nelson,
Yeah,
looks like you
I can
might.
start.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
thank you, Elizabeth. Well, I think it's about war and trauma, and trauma is here a key concept also in all of our presentations. The question is, how do we deal afterwards with the presence of trauma and its continued effects in our lives? Our work as psychoanalysts mainly is about finding a way to put trauma into words, as Rachel so well presented in her presentation, and also Joseph. I think humor is in many ways a form of dealing with some very unpleasant and traumatic situations. In the examples you gave, from the Zen Buddhist koans to Freud's humoristic quotation twice, I think we find there some form of dealing with traumatic situations, very heavily traumatic situations. I think the bridge that I can establish in my mind between war and pleasure has to do with the way we deal with trauma, with the forms of binding that traumatic experience makes as an exigence of work, as a way of putting ourselves and our minds to work towards a form of binding, and in this way, quoting Rachel's words, a bonus of pleasure by representing, by the work of representation. But we have also to think if there is some pleasure in unbinding ways of dealing with situations like war. Sometimes we are so much binded with ideas, images, and feelings, and there is no place for pleasure, just for suffering. And sometimes unbinding is also a way of pleasure, but that's a hard work, and a very hard work that, it's true, it has to do with resilience and surviving. First with surviving and being alive to do the work of binding and sometimes of unbinding.
Nice, thank you. Joe or Rachel?
Well, I wanted to just add a couple of thoughts to this, because it's a very painful question, you know, in so many ways. You know, part of it is in terms of like what I think all of us have kind of interestingly talked about beyond the pleasure principle as a kind of a watershed moment in Freud's thinking. And a lot of what's been going on in this current moment in the Ukraine and Russia just feels like a repetition compulsion. There's all of this kind of references back to the Second World War, back to the past. And it's like, it's sadly kind of like reliving this trauma or multiple traumas that we can see how, you know, so that's one thought I had. The other thought that we didn't really touch on, which comes to mind, and for me in terms of this, is like Erich Fromm had this idea of necrophilia, which had sadism, which he talked about as the pleasure in making things dead, you know, and that that although I didn't talk about it, we didn't really talk about kind of pleasure in something like that. but it might be kind of worth thinking about the pleasure in making things dead and sadism and, you know, kind of taking the life out of something.
Destructiveness, pleasure in destructiveness.
Right, which is something, a very difficult thing to think about and to talk about.
I think that might be what makes talking about pleasure today feel sort of dangerously frivolous. It's as if our minds should be on destructiveness. And I think Nelson's right, though, that, to pick up on afterwards. It's afterwards that the work of kind of making sense of what's happening and what's happening inside all of us, actually, I think can happen. So I think the afterwardsness of representation and binding is really important. I mean, to me, it feels too soon to be able to sort of think about what's happening at all. It doesn't feel representable at the moment.
Right, that's right.
Perfect. That's right.
I loved the, yeah.
Oh no, Rachel, go please.
No, I also just loved the Freud's remark about the hospitality of the SS, because I thought in that it's that extraordinary capacity to kind of be living an experience and to find a slight distance from it, and the resilience of the humor that he was able to kind of find, I thought was kind of very evocative, really.
I wonder, in hearing all of your presentations together, and then the question about resilience, I was wondering about creativity. Nelson, in your paper about vitalization, I think you even mentioned directly creativity. And of course, Joe, in yours about humor and joke work, and even the example of the monk. This is sort of a creative kind of response related to pleasure. And then Rachel, in yours about representation and using the examples of poets and painters and the sort of idea of passion. And then even this idea about the sadism or the pleasure in making things dead. I think about creativity as both something that's can be quite alive and positive. It can also be quite painful, the process. And so I wonder if there's anything there at all about thinking about creativeness, and even in the face of war, or maybe it is too soon to think about it, or afterwards creative solutions or creative how to go forward in a kind of creative, resilient way. I don't know if there's something there to respond to or not, but it's something that crossed my mind in hearing all of your presentations.
Thank you, Elizabeth. For sure, if we follow Winnicott's idea, our life is about preserving primal creativity, and it's about not submerging to reality too soon and facing reality too soon, because we have to maintain a certain intensity, and that's about vitalization, obviously. We have to maintain a capacity to creatively fight against some kind of realities that are imposed to us. Art, obviously, it's a way to deal with trauma, always, with pain, with suffering. Creativity, it's not something that is emerged without pain. It's not about pleasure. It's also about pleasure. But like Rachel presented, it's pleasure of representation and representation of pleasure. And this act of representing, it's about dealing with suffering and traumatic situations that occurs in everyone's life from the beginning. Obviously, if we think with Winnicott, we will say that traumatic situations are not needed, as we have in Freudian and Kleinian theory, for example. We can start with creativity. But I think the idea that trauma comes not first, but second, doesn't mean that we have to deal with creativity as a form to deal with suffering and traumatic situations. Well, sure, creativity is something very difficult to define. But if we put it together with this idea of vitalization, of putting erotic binding ways to deal with death, then we have something there. We have a way of thinking that creativity is the basis of vitality, maybe.
Thank you. Rachel or Joe,
Rachel,
thoughts on this?
I suppose one of the things I picked up in Nelson's paper, which I thought was very interesting, is this need to inject tension. That vitalization is actually about being able to tolerate an increase of tension. You know, you're sort of coming back to Freud and saying, no, it's not about, pleasure isn't about reduction. Well, pleasure might be about reduction, but vitalization is about being able to tolerate more tension, more agitation. And in a way, I think we're talking about a kind of tension between the need to be shielded, to shield the mind from an excess, but not too much, as I understand it. That actually, I think Nelson talks about injecting vitalization. You know, we've just got a sort of surgical image of a half-dead or inert self that needs to be prodded and activated. So it's the tension, I understood, really, that you're saying between something shielded, but also creativity coming out of an activation of some distress and unpleasure.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah, let me kind of add something. I really thought the Rachel, your idea of the bonus of pleasure was really significant in terms of representation and the act of representing things. And I feel like, as we're talking about creativity, it's like there's a kind of a part of us, each of us, that is inherently creative, and that has become, that needs to be kind of nurtured, you know, either with a kind of being vitalized in some way or nurtured in some way, but that it's just kind of part of us. And I kind of think of it, and I think, you know, as the kind of, there's a kind of an inherent poet in people, you know, that we might not be able to write poetry, but we're able to experience it and, you know, kind of have moments of that. And I think the kind of question is, which is what is, how to stimulate that, how to nurture that element. You know, the kind of blacksmith, the sound, which is so kind of interesting, and I assume it's the rhythmicness of it. That's part of that, what made it so vitalizing in the poem, at least. Or, you know, when we talk to babies, you know, in a kind of loving way, and we kind of echo their sounds and have them echo our sounds. It's kind of, I think, a beginning of that process. So I feel like it's like, how do we think about nurturing that? How do we think about helping to create that part of mind? You know.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. My question is about a concept which Green raised on one of his last writings when he talked about the problem of the pleasure of the object. With this concept, he indicated the problem of binding and that of the mother with or without pleasure, a theme which is of course linked to that of the, quote, dead mother. I think that considering the problem of pleasure of the object could be a crucial point about binding, a metapsychological way to think about intersubjectivity, possibly also taking on account the intrapsychic both of mother and child, and by equivalence of analyst and his or her patient. This may be coherent with the importance of process underlined by our chaplain, Rachel, and of the birth of representations. So I think that's a question for all of you.
Yes, I can start again. I think the work of Green by the end of the 1990s to the beginning of our 21st century was really an important way of putting in a very sophisticated manner object relations theory with drive theories.
Yeah.
And the idea of the couple, drive and object, the idea, I don't know how it in French is in a way, in Portuguese in another way. I have to translate it to English now, but I'll try to make myself clear. The idea of Green is that you have invitations from both sides. The drive invests and invites the object, and the object invests and invites drive. If we think in a mother-child relationship or baby relationship, you have something of the drive coming from the baby that invites something from the mother and invests the object, catechizes the object mother. And the other way also, it's simultaneous. The idea that mother and baby, they are both investing and inviting each other to a relationship, something like that. So the idea of a dead mother, the important idea, psychopathological idea from Green, a mother that is unable to receive this kind of invitation, provocation, of this kind of injection from her baby, and also unable to do the other way, invest, invite, and inject something into her baby. Let's put it this way. So it's a way to do with from the beginning, from a new metapsychology that put together object and drive. So it's object seeking, but it's also pleasure seeking at the same time. And that's really a very sophisticated and well-established way of thinking about what happens to all of us in the relationship with the world, with our mothers and fathers, and with everyone else. The idea that it's not a passive way of dealing either with the idea that drives is the only force that puts something in movement, and also the idea that's only the object that does something, more in Laplacian ways that sexuality comes from outside. So here we have something that puts Freud and Fairbairn and Winnicott together, and Bion and everybody, in a very sophisticated way of thinking. I think Andre Green is really one of the important thinkers of a new way, not scholarly way, Lacanian, Kleinian, ego psychology, but he's putting all these ideas in some way together, but in his way. And I think it's true. It has to do with intersubjectivity and intrapsychic dimensions simultaneously. I think I spoke too much. Please.
No,
Didn't.
no, you were
No.
good. Good.
I'm pleased that Nelson's picked up on the drive. My translation is drive object pair. Yeah, and
Better.
what I'm thinking also, I would just add to this, and I don't know the chronology in Green's work, but it's also his thinking about objectilizing and disobjectilizing,
Yes.
and
That's
yeah, the function of the mother in the kind of in this drive object pair as the one who supports eros, life, object finding, which then leads into representation, as opposed to a kind of dead mother who does not support the finding of objects and representations.
perfect.
Yeah, I'm not going to add to this.
Okay. We have about 10 minutes or so left. I'm wondering if there's anything that you would like to add to what you talked about, or what one of the other panelists spoke to, or anything else on this topic that was brought up today.
Here's a question that both of your papers kind of raised for me. Well, a couple of questions, but the first one is that there's a kind of I was trying to kind of think about the tension between binding, which to me seems like a very much of an energy concept, and kind of language and representation, which feels like it's coming out of a different kind of place of psychoanalytic thinking. And so I was wondering how if you could clarify that for me more, that there seems to be a tension between those two ideas, and kind of, I'm less in the binding camp, so I want to understand that better.
Rachel.
Well, I want to ask Joe what he means when he says he's less in the binding camp.
Well, I kind of, I think we all read Freud from our own perspective. So I enjoy reading Freud a lot, but I kind of find ways around some of the early ideas about energy and cathexis. I mean, I understand what he's saying, but I impose different meanings on it. And so, in terms of my development as a psychoanalyst, it was not very much in that drive-oriented position. And I think you're using those ideas, and they're very meaningful to you. So that's what I'm trying to get a better handle on, if I can, in a couple of minutes.
For myself, it has to do with these ideas of green, obviously, and the idea that we shouldn't move completely to intersubjectivity, losing the dimension of the intrapsychic will. So I think that what Freud describes in terms of eros and thanatos has to do with binding and unbinding. And it has to do with binding and unbinding, not only in the intrapsychic and in an economic way of thinking. It has to do with also with a way of thinking intersubjectivity. I think there are forces, there are drives that links us, that binds us to each other. Affect is about intensity, it's about energy. And words are also about intensity and energy. When we think about corporeality as a basis for our meetings and relationships in psychoanalytical encounter, we have different dimensions. We have a linguistic dimensions, obviously, but we have also affective, energetic forces that links us, binds us to each other. Transference, it's not only about images in our intrapsychic work. It's about binding two corporealities. It's about binding and trying to establish some way of dealing with deadness, distance, loneliness, and everything else that disturbs us in all our lives. I don't know if I answered you.
No, thank you. Thank you. You really are answering my question and giving me things to think about. So
I think for me, it's a kind of, I mean, it's quite a new language for me. I had a Kleinian first training. So to be thinking in terms of binding and the economic is quite new. But what I mean, in a way, my answer would be clinical. It's the experience of being with a patient where the body is alive and jumping around, and affects are coming in from one direction and then the other. The kind of feeling of force that's in the session, and the relationship between force and meaning, I think. And in a way, I'm probably influenced by Green, talking about those two dimensions, and French analysis, which really thinks carefully about force and meaning. But also Green's thinking about affect as a force which is extremely difficult to correlate with meaning. You know, you can't just follow the affect to get to the meaning, because the affect can be to do with something completely other. So it's the sort of slippage between the force of affect and feeling and meaning that I think is sort of an everyday clinical struggle to kind of bring the two together.
yeah, that's very helpful.
I have a question. We have a few minutes left, so let's see if we can squeeze it in. What about the other pleasure of aggression and destructivity as an expression of envy? Like Richard III, when one doesn't have the power to bring life as a generative mother to love, one can destroy in a grandiose way, perhaps as an expression of Freud's death drive.
Well, I'll try to say something about that. I think this has been a very hard thing for us to think about from many different perspectives, including a psychoanalytic perspective. And in some ways, you know, I remember once when I was teaching, a student pointed out that the kind of the pleasure and destructiveness is probably more central to human history than the other kinds of pleasures, you know, and so that this is a kind of pleasure that I think is very present, kind of the sense of destructiveness, which is the opposite in some ways of creativity, which is much harder. I think destructiveness is much easier than creativity. Whoops. I just got lost.
We can hear you.
I know, let me
Yes.
see if I could. There I am. I don't know why that happened. So that's kind of one part of it. And I think that, that from my perspective, I think about that as being kind of a very kind of paranoid organization, you know, where the kind of person is kind of set up in dichotomies, me or you. You know, I win, you lose. And I think that's kind of, as an analyst, you know, helping people move past those dichotomies, and that kind of paranoid organization is a central thing that we do. But but kind of acknowledging how central that pleasure and destructiveness is I think something very hard for us to do. So,
Rachel or Nelson, do you have thoughts on this question last few minutes?
Just to introduce a word that we haven't used yet in this question is the idea of violence, because psychoanalysis tries to understand what is violence and what's the meaning of violence. For sure, there's pleasure in violence, and we know it because we are surrounded by pictures and films and where violence is overall. And in our lives, if we don't pay attention, there is violence in the way of speaking. And Pierre Zolagner's idea of violence, it's very meaningful to understand something about psychoanalysis and about relationships. But I don't want to go further, but just to remind that destructiveness is really about violence. And there's violence in sexuality also. There's pleasure with violence, but please, Rachel.
No, I agree with that. And I mean, we were also not talking about sadism, which is another place we might go with this. I mean, I think, you know, how we understand destructiveness would take us into, it's an enormous area, which this question takes us into. I suppose I think also violence is very much to do with what Joe is talking about, which is identity, and that it's the threat to identity that is such a kind of provocative violence. But sadism, I think, is another thing, actually.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your wonderful presentations and discussion, and to the audience for the questions. What a wonderful topic for discussion and continued research and scholarly work. And I hope that the discussion continues, especially today in the situation that we're in. There's a LinkedIn discussion group for further discussion on today's topic. You can search, "Is pleasure still a key concept for psychoanalysis?" on LinkedIn. And the upcoming webinar, it's Women in the Leadership of Psychoanalysis. This will be March 25th at 16 o'clock to 17:30 GMT time. And you can visit www.IPA World for all the latest information about upcoming webinars and for recordings of the past webinars. I want to thank you all again for joining us today in this webinar. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank
Joe,
you so
Nelson,
much.
and
Thank
Rachel.
you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Now,